This is the video that the Peugeot dealership sent to the owner of this 308. And this is the invoice to replace just the front brake pads and discs. £432 for 2 discs and 4 pads. That's absolutely insane. You can buy the same quality parts for well under half of that, and even if you didn't have any tools yourself and had to buy some, you could still do it all for less money than they want to charge. Seriously. Now, in this specific car's case, you might also want to buy some replacement wheel bolts to replace the single worst design of locking wheel nuts or wheel bolts ever, and probably an extractor set, but I'll get to that in a second. First, you will need to use a breaker bar or an impact wrench to loosen the wheel bolts, and then jack up the car and remove the bolts fully, and of course the wheel too. You can then remove the 2 T30 Torx screws that hold the disc in place. It is best to use an impact if you have one here, as these really like to strip themselves. With those screws out, you can then grab a 10mm 12-point spanner to remove the e-Torx bolts that hold the caliper on. The reason I don't recommend you use an e-Torx socket here is that, at least for the top bolt, Peugeot in their infinite wisdom aligned the brake hose so you physically cannot get a socket on them. The spanner and a mallet works just fine though. With those out, you can then pull on the caliper sort of forwards, leveraging from the back to push the piston back a little bit so that the caliper will easily lift off. Use a bungee cord to hang the caliper from the spring. Don't just let it dangle on the brake hose. That's a great way to need to replace your brake hose very soon. With the caliper out of the way, use an 18mm socket and either a breaker bar or an impact wrench to remove the 2 caliper bracket bolts. The bracket should then lift up and off of the disc with a pad still attached to it. You can then take the disc off of the hub. We had to use a rubber mallet to free it from the hub as it was a little stuck on. Next, get your new discs. For this non-GTI model, it uses 283mm discs, and use some brake cleaner to spray down the disc. It comes with a thin layer of oil to stop them from rusting in storage, but that oil can ruin your new pads and make those brakes next to useless, so definitely clean them off. If you want to be extra helpful to the next person replacing these discs, you can apply a light coating of copper anti-seize to the central ringland. Don't get any in the bolt holes though. Then you can place the disc onto the hub and tighten those 2 T30 screws back in. They really don't need to be that tight. Pull the old pads off of the caliper bracket and then attach the frankly annoying little springs to the ears of the pads. Use a wire brush to thoroughly clean the bracket side clips, as these are where your brake pads slide forward and backwards, so making sure this area is clean and smooth is important for good brake feel. You can then attach the caliper bracket to the hub with its 2 bolts. I believe these get tightened to 35mm plus 45 degrees, although good and tight at around 120mm should be just fine too. If you want to, you can add a dab of copper anti-seize to the spring clips so that they slide freely, and then push them into the caliper bracket. I had to use some channel locks to squeeze them a touch, as they wouldn't fit into the bracket otherwise. Once those pads are in though, the last thing you need to do before putting the caliper back on is compress the piston back into the caliper itself. There are some proper tools for this that I would recommend, and I'll leave some links in the description for you if you're interested, but I just used my channel locks and it worked perfectly fine. You can then place the caliper back down and install the e-Torx bolts. These should be tightened to 30Nm. You can then put the wheel bolts back on and tighten them to 100Nm. Personally, the second you get the stock locking wheel bolt out of the wheel, throw it in the bin. Seriously, this is why. The locking portion of the bolt is turned by just 4 tiny dowels in the key. And what's worse is that the whole locking portion is only pressed onto the actual bolt using minuscule splines. That means when you go to apply torque, it just shears the tiny splines and the head comes off. This is where those bolt extractors come in real handy. You will need to find the right replacement, as Peugeot uses a style of bolt that is wildly different to what you'll find on pretty much every other car, at least the one I've worked on, so it might be a bit harder to find the right ones. Your Car Parts does sell the right style though, which is where we bought 4 replacement bolts. To get the old snapped head bolt out, I used a 12mm extractor socket and my breaker bar to spin it free. We did end up basically torquing the bolt to spec, but the way that the bolt failed ended up making it pretty easy for us to move with that extractor socket. Lastly, I want to show you why we were doing this job in the first place. I mean, neither the pads nor the discs were fully worn down. The car could have easily gone several thousand more miles on these pads if it weren't for this. On the passenger side, for some reason, the inboard side of the disc had a massive ridge in it, and of course a complementary groove in the pad. The disc had pretty excessive wear on that inboard side, and with any more wear, it might have shattered. We aren't quite sure what could have caused this. At first we thought it was a groove from something getting stuck between the disc and the pad, but the fact that this is embossed on the disc and indented into the pad is pretty confusing. If you have any suggestions or thoughts on this, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. Of course, if you're doing this job yourself, make sure to do both sides of the car. We did, and I never recommend only replacing one side of your car's brake components, whether that's just pads or pads and discs, calipers, anything. It is very much best to do both sides so that you have even braking, you don't accidentally veer off the road when you just apply the brakes. But if you've done both of that, you've done both sides, if you've torqued all of the bolts, congratulations, you've just replaced your pads and discs and you're good to go for another several tens of thousands of miles, I suppose depending on how you drive it. Now, if you're interested in any of the parts or tools that I've used in this video, I will leave some links in the description if you're interested. Also, if you want to see more videos like this one, feel free to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell notification icon. You can also check out plenty of other repair guides and even full car reviews on the channel. They'll be on the end cards that should be popping up any second. And that's kind of it. If you have any questions, suggestions, or anything else, feel free to leave those in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.